My son died in a car crash, but a few days later, the officer told me he wasn't the only target. I still remember the chill in my spine when they whispered that it was my daughter-in-law who planned it. If I had sat on the right side instead of the left that day, I might not be here to tell you what really happened. The highway was almost empty, just the two of us and the hush of snow drifting across the windshield. My son Mason was driving like he always did, one hand on the wheel, the other occasionally flicking the heater dial. It was late, close to midnight, and we were heading home from the quarterly shareholders' meeting of the construction company his father had once built from the ground up. I remember leaning back in my seat, tired but content in that quiet way mothers sometimes feel when their grown child is doing well. Mason had been patient all day, guiding me through the financial slides, whispering things under his breath to make me smile when the room got too stiff. He glanced at me briefly, the corner of his mouth pulling up. Angela's been pushing me to fast-track the ownership transfer, he said. Wants me to have it all locked down before the holidays. I nodded, not really thinking twice. She was always efficient like that. The snow began to fall harder. Mason slowed the car a little, turned the wipers up. I noticed he gripped the wheel tighter than usual. She's also asking about the account, he said. The retirement one. The one you signed over to me years ago. She wants access to it. That made me look at him. I asked what he told her. I told her no, he said simply. That's between me and you. We sat in silence for a bit. I could feel something in his voice that didn't quite sit right with me. The road curved ahead, and that's when I saw it. Bright headlights coming fast from the other direction. Mason's eyes darted to the rearview mirror. The car behind us was speeding up too. Everything after that happened all at once. A flash of light. A jolt so hard my teeth clacked. The sound of metal screaming. Then cold. My face against glass. My ears ringing. When I opened my eyes again, I wasn't in the car anymore. I was in a hospital bed, tubes in my arm, and a nurse speaking softly near the door. My body felt like it had been dragged through concrete. But all I could ask, over and over in my head, was where Mason was. A man in a uniform walked in and gently closed the door. He sat beside me like he had done it before. He didn't say much at first, just placed a plastic bag with my son's wristwatch inside on the table and looked down at his hands. Mrs. Langford, he said, I'm so sorry. My son was gone. That moment, I don't know how to explain it. It was like my mind and my heart split in two, one half trying to scream, the other frozen solid. If you've ever lost a child, you'll understand. And if you haven't, I hope you never do. But as I would learn later, that crash wasn't just an accident. And Mason, he hadn't been driving alone in more ways than one. Stay with me. The truth doesn't come all at once. It comes in pieces. And sometimes, the pieces cut deeper than the fall. 3 days after the funeral, the house was too quiet. Mason's jacket still hung by the door, his coffee mug untouched on the kitchen counter. The silence had weight. I kept moving, refolding linens that didn't need folding, reheating tea I never drank. Grief does that. It confuses your sense of time, makes you busy in the wrong ways. Angela arrived mid-morning. No knock, just the sound of the door opening and her heels clicking against the hardwood. She walked in like she owned the place, head high, hair too perfect for a woman supposedly in mourning. She didn't look at the framed photo of Mason on the mantel, didn't even pause. Instead, she dropped a thick manila envelope on the kitchen island and slid it toward me like she was handing off a grocery list. Her nails were freshly done, pale pink, neat, sharp. Her voice was smooth but flat. "This is the paperwork for the estate transition," she said. "The board already reviewed it. You just need to sign so we can move forward." I didn't touch the envelope. She added that she and Mason had been planning this for months, that the company needed fresh leadership, that everything would stay in the family. But I wasn't born yesterday. Angela had always been poised, polished. She could handle 3 conversations at once and never miss a beat. But this was different. There was a flicker behind her eyes, something too controlled, too clean. I told her I wanted time, just a few days to go through things, to understand what Mason had left behind. I needed to breathe. Angela smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Of course," she said. "Just don't wait too long. Some things lose value if you sit on them too long." Then she left. No hug, no pause, no grief. That night, I couldn't sleep. My hands kept going back to the envelope. Eventually, I opened it. Inside were pages of transfer forms, asset sheets, stock reallocations, all with spaces for my signature. Angela had prepared everything, pre-typed, perfectly aligned. Even the witness lines had sticky notes. But something stopped me cold. The document listed Mason as having finalized a power of attorney 2 weeks before his death. It gave Angela full control of both the company and the personal trust we'd set up together nearly 20 years ago. A trust I had helped him build when he was still learning how to balance spreadsheets and field calls. And the signature on the last page didn't look right. It had the shape of Mason's writing, but it lacked pressure. His usual looping L was stunted, incomplete. I pulled out an old birthday card he'd written me last year and held them side by side. They didn't match. I didn't know what that meant, but I knew it meant something. The next morning, I made a quiet trip to our family attorney's office. I didn't call ahead. I didn't tell Angela. I brought both documents. I asked him to compare the signatures. I asked if there was any filing of a new will. He looked at me for a long time and said nothing at first. Then he opened a drawer and pulled out a sealed envelope. Mason's name was written in blue ink, dated 10 days before the accident. He said Mason had dropped it off himself, asking it be held until after a formal update. He never made it back to finish. Inside that envelope was a draft of a new will. Angela wasn't in it. And just like that, the questions started multiplying. Not just about money, about timing, about pressure, about what Mason had seen or suspected in those final weeks, and about what Angela might have been willing to do to make sure none of it saw the light of day. It was a Tuesday when the officer called me. His name was Detective Kraus. Calm voice, short sentences. He asked if I was willing to come in to review something related to Mason's crash. I asked if it was urgent. He said it would be best not to wait too long. At the station, the air was cool and still. I could hear a printer working somewhere in the background and the low hum of fluorescent lights overhead. Kraus led me to a small interview room. Nothing dramatic. A table, 2 chairs, a metal cabinet. He didn't sit, just opened a thin folder and placed it in front of me. Inside were stills, security camera footage, dated the night of the accident. One frame showed Mason at a gas station, standing near the car, alone, looking down at his phone. The next frame, 5 minutes later, showed Angela pulling into the lot in her own car. She got out, walked over to Mason, handed him what looked like a drink, then kissed him on the cheek. Harmless, on the surface. But the timestamp didn't make sense. She had told me she was at home that night, planning a presentation. Kraus then pulled out a second set of images. This time, from a parking garage 2 blocks from that gas station. A different car. a man stepping out. Tall, broad shoulders, wearing a work jacket with the name Jules stitched on the chest. He handed Angela what looked like a pouch, then got back in his car and drove off. I looked up. Kraus finally spoke. "We believe that pouch may have contained medication, possibly a sedative. We're working with toxicology to confirm." I didn't know what to say. My mind tried to keep up. Mason was healthy. He didn't use anything, never had. Kraus continued. He said there was something else. The GPS data from Mason's car had been accessed remotely 2 days before the crash, accessed from an IP address that matched a home in Troy, New York. Angela's cousin lived there. The system had been reprogrammed to route them through a back road near Bear Hollow, where the crash eventually happened. He said they weren't ruling anything out. I sat there, staring at the stills, trying to imagine how Mason must have felt in that last hour. Whether he was dizzy behind the wheel, whether he noticed the turn was too sharp, too late, whether he thought, even for a second, that someone had done this to him. Kraus asked if Mason had shown any signs of distress leading up to the trip. I told him about the conversation in the car, about the way Mason gripped the wheel, about Angela asking for access to the trust. The detective nodded slowly. He said he'd seen too many accidents that weren't accidents at all, that sometimes people don't push off a cliff. They set up the path and let the wheel do the rest. As I walked out of that station, the cold hit me different. Not just winter cold, but the kind that comes from knowing your life has started to split into two parts: the time before you knew, and everything after. At home, I found myself staring at Mason's boots by the door. He had left them there after our last snow. I used to think they were just muddy footprints I'd have to clean up. Now they were something else entirely. A mark of where he stood before it all slipped away. And in the quiet of that evening, I thought about the man in the work jacket, the one named Jules, the man behind the glass. And I realized something I hadn't let myself admit until then. This wasn't just betrayal. This was strategy. I hadn't stepped into Mason's garage since the week he died. It still smelled faintly of motor oil and pine from the air fresheners he always clipped near the workbench. His old baseball cap was still hanging on the wall, next to a shelf lined with jars full of nails, bolts, and screws sorted by size. It used to be our project space when he was little. We built birdhouses together, fixed up my old lawnmower, even tried to rebuild a radio once. After high school, it became his retreat. He added tools I didn't recognize, machines that whirred and clicked. That morning, after seeing the photos from the police and remembering what Angela had pushed in front of me, I walked out there with a small flashlight and a notebook. I didn't know what I was looking for, just knew I had to keep looking. It was the toolbox that caught my attention. Not the metal one on the table, but the old wooden one Mason had once sanded and stained by hand. He had kept it on the bottom shelf, tucked under a tarp. I dragged it out and opened it slowly. The top tray had the usual stuff: wrenches, wire cutters, a handful of screws. But underneath, in a false bottom I didn't even know existed, was a thick envelope taped shut with painter's tape. I peeled it open. Inside were printed emails, not from Mason, from Angela. Copies of exchanges between her and someone named Jules H. The headers dated back nearly 6 months. At first, I didn't understand what I was reading. Mentions of asset movement, timelines, legal routing, words like delay signature and trust override. Then I hit the one line that made my stomach turn. Once the transfer clears, we're free. The old man will never see it coming. I felt the heat rise in my chest. I sat back against the bench, holding that page in my hand. The paper shook, whether from my fingers or the weight of the betrayal. I couldn't tell. There was more. One sheet looked like a scanned check. $50,000 paid from one of Mason's business accounts, addressed to a repair shop I didn't recognize. The signature on it was Mason's name, but again, something felt off. At the bottom of the stack was a single photo. Angela and Jules, sitting across from each other in a diner, not intimate, but too close, smiling. I closed the box and stood there for a moment. I wasn't crying. The tears had dried somewhere between the hospital and the attorney's office, but my hands were cold. Back inside the house, I copied the documents, sealed the originals, and placed them in my own safe. Then I called Kraus. I told him I found something and that I wasn't sending it over email. We met in a parking lot near the library, neutral ground. I gave him the envelope. He flipped through it, page by page, face steady, but eyes narrowing. Then he looked at me and said he needed a few days. I told him to take his time, but I also told him I wasn't staying still. That night, I opened Mason's laptop. I remembered his password. It was the name of his dog growing up, with the year he graduated tacked on the end. What I found wasn't dramatic, just pattern. Angela had logged into the shared bank account the night before the crash. She moved 15,000 into a personal card account under a name I didn't recognize. The next day, that card was used to purchase 2 plane tickets to Belize. One for Angela, one for Jules H. My breath caught. I closed the laptop and sat in the dark. This wasn't just betrayal. It was premeditated disappearance, and Mason was never meant to live through that drive. I met Jules once. It was brief. A handshake in a hospital hallway, weeks before the accident. Mason had sprained his wrist working under a car. Angela stayed behind with the paperwork, and I offered to drive him in. While we waited, a man showed up in worn jeans and a dark flannel jacket. Tall, thick wrists, the kind of man who didn't talk unless he had to. He said he was an old friend of Angela's, claimed he'd been in town for a quick job and just wanted to check on Mason. I remember thinking it was odd. Mason barely looked at him, gave him a nod, then went back to scrolling his phone. But Angela smiled wide when she saw him. That handshake stuck with me. And now, days after uncovering the envelope in the garage, his name came up again. Not in passing. In every trail I followed, it was all starting to fit together like puzzle pieces that had been flipped face up too late. Detective Kraus called the next afternoon, said they were moving fast now. The repair shop listed on the check was real, a small garage outside Binghamton, owned by Jules Huntley. The address matched the one used to access Mason's GPS. Kraus's team had already started looking into the bank accounts, but that wasn't what froze me. He said a private investigator from their department had done a sweep of surveillance near the Belize airport. They found 2 faces on a camera at a car rental booth, Angela and Jules, 3 days after the funeral. She had told me she was going to spend that weekend with her cousin in Connecticut. She never even sent a thank you card after the service. The worst part was, I hadn't noticed she was gone. I kept thinking about the look on Mason's face during that last drive. I thought it was about stress, about the conversation we had. But now I wondered if he had known something, if part of him had already sensed what was coming. That night, I sat in Mason's room. Not the one he shared with Angela, but the spare bedroom he used when he needed space. His tools were always scattered there, a couple flannel shirts over the back of the chair. I opened the nightstand and found an old voice recorder. Nothing special, the kind he used when working out ideas for the business. I pressed play. His voice crackled through the speaker. Tired. Flat. Angela thinks I'm too soft. She says I don't see what's good for me. She wants the money now. Keeps asking about access. Says we could start over, somewhere else, but I can't shake the feeling she doesn't mean we. I think she means her and someone else. I paused the recording. He knew. He knew and didn't say a word to me. He must have felt trapped, between love and suspicion, between trust and fear. It lit something in me. Not rage, not yet, but something quiet and clear. A sense that I couldn't just wait anymore. I had to move. The next morning, I called the attorney again. I asked him to hold off on releasing any assets. Told him I had reason to believe fraudulent activity might be involved. He didn't ask questions, just said he'd freeze everything until further notice. Then I started calling a few people I knew. Old colleagues from the community board, one or two women from the county clerk's office. I asked about asset tracing, about digital forensics. I asked if anyone knew how long it took to flag an offshore transfer. They did. It wouldn't be easy, but it wouldn't be impossible. And now that I had Mason's voice, they wouldn't be able to silence mine. The house had grown quiet in a different way. Not the kind of silence you live in after a loss, but a waiting silence. The kind that hums low when you know something is about to shift. I moved slower, thought sharper. Every drawer I opened, every document I reread, had weight. It was early morning when Detective Kraus called again. His voice was more direct this time. The lab results from Mason's toxicology had come in. They found traces of diphenhydramine and zolpidem, not in a recreational amount, enough to cause drowsiness and delayed reflexes. Combined, they could impair judgment without rendering someone fully unconscious. The pill bottle wasn't found in the car, but the compound matched a brand that had recently been prescribed to Angela under her maiden name, a pharmacy 3 towns over, paid for in cash. That detail stuck in me like a sliver of ice. Kraus said this strengthened the case, but it wasn't enough to charge anyone yet. The story could still be explained away: stress, grief, error. He asked me to keep quiet, not confront Angela. I told him I had no plans to see her again. Not now. What I didn't say was that I had already written a letter to Mason's old accountant. I told him I suspected discrepancies in the company's insurance and distributions, and that I believed Mason had signed a second document the week before the crash, a revision to the trust. I knew Angela wouldn't have destroyed it. Not right away. If she forged anything, she'd keep the original somewhere safe, in case she needed to prove her version of the story. That night, I went to her house. I didn't knock. She wasn't there. I still had the emergency key Mason had left in the flower pot years ago. She never changed the locks. I moved carefully, straight to the upstairs study. She had converted the old guest room into a workspace. Sleek, black furniture. Desk organized with sterile precision. I opened every drawer, looked through every file. Then I saw it. A manila envelope labeled Legal 2023. Inside were photocopies of Mason's will, the trust, and one notarized amendment with his signature. But that wasn't what made my pulse jump. Behind it was a sticky note, sloppy handwriting. Ask Jay if it'll hold. No date, no initials. I took photos of everything and left everything as I found it. Then I slipped out the door, closed it gently, and returned to my car. My hands were cold again. The next morning, I met Kraus at a diner far from town. I slid the phone across the table, showing him the images. He looked them over carefully, said they would bring in a forensic specialist. If the signature on the amendment didn't match Mason's, we would be looking at not just fraud, but premeditated obstruction. And then he said something that made me pause. He told me I had to be ready, that if this went forward, it wouldn't be private anymore. People would talk. Angela would fight back. Her attorney would come swinging. Everything Mason built might be dragged into court. I nodded, not because I was ready, but because I had made peace with never being ready. That night, I found myself back in the garage again, the place where the truth had started to reveal itself. I opened a drawer and took out a photo. Mason, at age 10, covered in sawdust, holding a crooked birdhouse, smiling without knowing what life would demand from him too soon. And I realized something I hadn't dared admit until now. Justice doesn't arrive loud. It starts in quiet rooms, with old women holding photos and envelopes, piecing together the truth while no one's watching. It starts with a whisper, and I was done whispering. 2 days after the meeting with Kraus, I got a call from someone I hadn't spoken to in almost 8 years. Her name was Darlene White. We used to serve together on the local heritage committee, back when I still volunteered for the Historical Society. She worked in records at the county courthouse now. I'd left a message through a mutual friend, and she was calling me back. Her voice was low and careful. She said the name Jules Huntley had come up in a recent audit. He wasn't just listed on a few maintenance contracts with independent garages. He was also quietly listed as a silent co-owner on a Shell LLC that funneled funds into an account opened right after Mason's death. The name on the account wasn't Angela's, it was mine. That hit me like a slap in a snowstorm. The LLC was registered under a trust my husband and I had dissolved more than 20 years ago. I hadn't used that entity since before Mason was married. But someone had reactivated the name. Same tax ID, same structure. Just enough old data to seem legitimate, just enough new fingerprints to make it dangerous. It meant one thing. Someone was using my identity to access funds. Darlene said she flagged it for internal review, but if I wanted it to disappear, I had to act fast. Once the paperwork reached the state level, it would trigger a federal look, and any fraud tied to my name could get complicated. She offered no advice, just facts. That was her way, always had been. I thanked her, hung up, and sat in silence. The betrayal wasn't abstract anymore. It had my name on it, my blood, my past. That night, I went to the garage again, not to search, but to think, to sit in the place Mason had loved most. I ran my hand over the worn leather of his office chair, stared at the notes pinned on his wall, still curling at the edges. There was a single yellowed blueprint pinned under a rusted tack, an expansion layout for the business he never got to build. I cried for the first time in days, not loud, just enough to let the pressure go, just enough to remember that I was still a mother, not just a witness. The next morning, I called Kraus and told him everything. About the LLC, about the identity theft, about the photo I had taken from Angela's office. He listened, then told me they'd already begun a deeper investigation into Jules. It turns out Jules had used multiple aliases in other states. Nothing stuck legally, but it painted a picture. A man who knew how to erase footprints, how to blend, how to manipulate. Kraus told me one more thing. The fire that destroyed the car after the crash, Angela had told first responders that I'd been smoking in the car, that I might have dropped the lighter. But fire investigators found an ignition residue trail near the undercarriage. Accelerant-soaked cloth, placed with intent. That detail had been buried in the early report. She had blamed me, to cover her own tracks. I hung up and poured myself a glass of water. My hands didn't shake this time. Later that afternoon, I drove out to the lake, the one Mason used to take me to when he was small. He always said it was the only place that felt quiet without being empty. I sat on the bench near the dock and let the wind sting my face. Then I made a list. I wrote every name, every address, every connection. I wrote what I knew and what I suspected. Not for the police, for me. To remind myself this was real. That I wasn't imagining shadows. That the story was mine to finish. And I wrote one final line. She lit the match. But I still own the house. I had the list. I had the truth. What I didn't have yet was the proof that would break everything wide open. Kraus had asked me to stay quiet. But silence had gotten me here. Silence had nearly buried Mason's memory under lies and forged pages. So I decided to do something I never thought I would. I reached out to Angela. Not directly. I sent a message through her assistant at the garage's front desk. Told them I wanted to meet her for a personal conversation, somewhere neutral. Said it was about Mason's final wishes. That I didn't want lawyers or detectives involved. Just us. She agreed. Too quickly. We met at a little restaurant off the freeway, a place where nobody would know our faces. She wore a navy pantsuit, too crisp for someone supposedly still in mourning. Her hair was flat-ironed straight, her smile polite. I could see the calculation behind her eyes before she even opened her mouth. I didn't greet her, just slid a folder across the table. Inside were the photos I'd taken of the forged documents, the sticky note, a printed record of the LLC under my name. Copies, not originals. She looked at them without flinching, took her time. When she finally spoke, she said it was all nonsense, misunderstandings, people with too much time and emotion clouding their judgment. She even leaned in, placing her hand on mine like we were family. And then she slipped. She said, "If Mason hadn't changed that trust, you'd be sitting on everything right now." I never told her Mason had changed the trust. That was never made public. I pulled my hand away, took the folder back, said I needed some air and left her sitting there. Outside, I didn't cry. I didn't even breathe hard. I just called Kraus from the parking lot, told him what she said. He listened. Quiet, as usual. Then he told me something that made everything tilt. The notary who supposedly witnessed Mason's signature on the amendment was a man named Edward T. Berkeley. Only problem was, Edward had been dead for 5 months before the document was dated. It was the break we needed. Later that week, Kraus called to say the investigation was officially opening. Angela and Jules were being quietly monitored. Phones tapped, finances traced. It wasn't enough for arrest yet, but they were close. And in the meantime, I had to be careful. He told me that people who forge wills and try to erase paper trails are often sloppy in other areas too, especially with money. He said if I wanted to move ahead, I needed to start transferring Mason's assets into a protective trust, one that Angela couldn't access even if she tried. I called my lawyer the next day. We began the process. But before we finished, something strange happened. A letter arrived in my mailbox. No return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper. It was a bank statement. A large withdrawal. From a trust account I didn't recognize. The name on the signature line wasn't mine, but the handwriting tried to be. It was a forgery. Again. This time, they were going after what little I had left in my name. But I was no longer the woman who stared through tears, hoping for answers. I was done hoping. I made copies of everything, sent them to Kraus, to my lawyer, to the county records office. And one, just one, I sent anonymously to Angela's lawyer's firm. No words, just the signature, the account, the lie. Let her squirm first. The game she started was about to turn. And this time the fire wouldn't be the kind that burned wood. The morning of the mediation, I wore the same black dress I had worn to Mason's memorial. Not because I wanted to honor the memory of that day, but because I needed a reminder. A reminder of who I had been when I walked out of that chapel alone, and who I refused to be now. The room was sterile. One long oak table, 4 leather chairs on each side. I sat on the right, next to Kraus and my estate attorney, Ms. Daly. Across from us sat Angela, her lips pressed into a thin smile, and her new counsel, a sharp-suited man from a firm out of Baltimore. Jules wasn't present. According to her attorney, he had no legal standing in the matter. It didn't matter. This wasn't about drama or confrontation. It was about presentation, laying the truth out like glass and letting it reflect. Ms. Daly began calmly. She presented the evidence, the bank accounts, the forged trust amendment, the death of Edward T. Berkeley, and the impossibility of his witnessing the signature. She mentioned the LLC in my name, the photos, the notarized statements we had secured from old employees at the garage who admitted to being pressured to lie. Angela remained composed, barely blinked, until we showed the surveillance footage. 2 months before Mason died, Angela and Jules were seen meeting at a local notary office. They left with a document. The timestamp aligned perfectly with the date on the trust amendment. We had no audio, but we didn't need it. Kraus leaned in then and slid a final sheet across the table. A list of withdrawals from the forged account. Dates, amounts, recipients. The last name on the list, Angela Huntley. That was the moment the smile cracked. Her attorney asked for a recess. When they returned 20 minutes later, they made an offer. Angela would surrender all claim to Mason's estate. She would release any pending legal action, including the one she had quietly filed contesting the division of marital assets. In return, we would agree not to press charges, not to go public, not to notify the press. It was a coward's deal. But I accepted it. Because I knew something Angela didn't. The county prosecutor had already opened a parallel case. The agreement in that room had no bearing on criminal liability. The only thing she could avoid was civil exposure. Let her have her moment of relief. It wouldn't last. When it ended, she stood and looked at me like she was seeing me for the first time. Not as an old woman or a grieving mother, but as someone who didn't break, someone who had outlasted her. I didn't speak. I just gathered my documents, folded them neatly into my bag, and left. Outside, the sky had turned cold, pale blue with the wind cutting sharp off the water. I walked to my car slowly, sat behind the wheel for a long time before turning the key. Then I drove to Mason's grave. The ground was still soft, the stone freshly carved. I knelt, brushed away the leaves, and laid my hand on the letters. I did it, I whispered. I didn't let them win. Behind me, the wind moved through the trees like breath. The sun broke through the clouds for a moment, warming my back. There were still hearings to attend, still paperwork to file. But for the first time since the crash, I felt something shift inside me. Not victory, closure, the kind that doesn't shout, the kind that just releases. I stood, dusted off my coat, and walked back to the car. This time, I didn't look back. It was nearly 2 weeks after the mediation when the envelope arrived. Hand-delivered, not by post. Thick, cream-coloured, with no return address. For a brief second, I thought it might be from Angela, some pathetic attempt at apology or manipulation. But when I opened it, the handwriting stopped me cold. It was Mason's. He had written the letter 3 weeks before the crash. The date on the top corner sent a chill straight through me. His attorney had held on to it, honouring his instruction to deliver it only if the estate was ever legally contested. I sat on the porch, hands trembling slightly, and read every word. He knew something, or maybe he just suspected. But the letter wasn't about fear. It was about faith. He wrote about me, about growing up watching me work 2 jobs, never missing a beat. about how I made everything stretch, even when we had nothing but boxed rice and frozen peas. He said I never once made him feel poor, even when the lights were off for days. Then he mentioned Angela, said he had been struggling for months, that there were moments he didn't recognize her anymore. There were gaps in stories, passwords changed, money missing, but he hadn't had the courage to confront it. Not yet. He said the letter was his way of making sure that, if anything ever happened, I wouldn't be left vulnerable, that I would have the tools to stand my ground. Mason had set up a second will, one he didn't tell her about, filed quietly with a private firm he trusted from law school days. The estate division in that document was simple. His home in Vermont, the investments, the retirement fund, everything was left to me, and a trust was established in his name for a non-profit he had been quietly funding for years. Angela's name didn't appear once. The weight of that choice crushed me and lifted me at the same time. I had spent months believing I had nothing left of my son, but in truth, he had prepared the last word. A week later, I drove back to the law office in Vermont. They knew I was coming. They had the second will. Everything was in order. And then came the twist I didn't expect. In a separate file, Mason had left instructions for a foundation, a vocational program for kids aging out of foster care. Not just a name or a mission statement, but full structure, partnerships, local staff. He had been building it quietly, funneling a small percentage of his income into a holding account. Over $100,000 had already been set aside. He had even named it the Eli Project. Eli was the name of Mason's childhood best friend, a boy from a group home who disappeared from their town the summer before senior year. Mason never forgot him. And now, years later, he had built something for him. I sat in that office for hours, going over every document, every detail. And I knew, deep down, that Angela never stood a chance, not just legally, but morally. Mason's heart had been somewhere she never cared to look. That night, back home, I opened the windows wide. The air smelled like rain and pine. I didn't cry. I didn't speak. I just let the silence fill the room and stretch around me like an old coat. The kind of silence that tells you something is over. Not just the legal battles, not just the grief, but the version of yourself that used to believe you had to be silent to survive. And something about that, about finally stepping into the light Mason had left behind, felt more like justice than anything I had planned. The following days felt strangely steady. For the first time in months, there was no court date looming, no deposition, no new lie to uncover. My mornings were quiet. I sat with my coffee in the sunroom Mason had built the summer after college, when he said I deserved light in every corner of my life. Now, light poured through every window. I spent hours going through his foundation plans. The Eli Project was more than I imagined. Not just an idea scribbled in notebooks, but fully structured. It included mentorship tracks, trade skills, emotional support services. And there was one note at the end of the packet that undid me completely. He had written, in his messy handwriting, "Mum will know how to finish this." He trusted me, not just to survive, but to carry on what mattered most to him. I met with the attorneys and the program director Mason had already interviewed months ago. Her name was Michelle, a sharp woman in her 40s who had grown up in foster care herself. She looked me in the eye after reading Mason's final letter and said, without any performative softness, "We're going to do this right." We registered the non-profit officially under his name. We secured the initial funding and began drafting outreach to local agencies. I didn't have a fancy degree or years of experience in non-profits. What I had was lived knowledge of loss, resilience, and grit. And I finally stopped hiding behind my silence. Angela made one last attempt to interfere. Her new boyfriend, the man who ran the garage, filed a defamation suit after one of the insurance investigators went public with the tampering evidence. But the case barely made it past the first hearing. Their credibility was so thin, the judge refused to move forward. I didn't show up for that one. I didn't need to. They had already lost something more important than money or property. They had lost the ability to pretend. That fall, I stood on a modest stage in a community centre outside of Albany. Behind me, a banner read, Eli Project Kickoff. My hands trembled slightly as I held the microphone. Not from nerves, but from something deeper, something that felt like responsibility. I told the small crowd about Mason, about Eli, about what it meant to take pain and make it useful. And as I spoke, I saw faces in the crowd light up, not with pity, but with recognition. People knew what it felt like to be thrown away, and more than that, they knew what it meant to keep going anyway. When I stepped down, Michelle met me at the side of the stage. She didn't say anything at first, just reached into her bag and handed me an envelope. Inside was a small gold pin, an old emblem from her foster home. She said she kept it as a reminder. Now she wanted me to have it. I pressed it into my palm and nodded. That night, I sat again in the sunroom, light fading to blue outside. The house was still, but not empty. Somewhere in the quiet, I felt Mason, not as a memory, not as grief, but as momentum. I never moved out of that house. Not because I was holding on to grief, but because every wall, every step on those old stairs reminded me that healing didn't always require escape. Sometimes it required staying, sitting still, letting time show you what remains after everything else has fallen away. I kept Mason's room exactly as it was the day he left for that drive, his sneakers by the door, a flannel shirt draped across the desk chair, not as a shrine, but as a choice. I didn't want to pack him away to make others comfortable. His presence still lived here, and I let it. The non-profit grew slowly but surely. Michelle became more than just a director. She became a friend. We spent afternoons planning, strategizing, visiting shelters and schools, sharing long silences when words felt too small. One afternoon, I walked past the garage near downtown, where Angela's boyfriend used to work. The place had been boarded up, a foreclosure notice curled under rusted bolts. The silence around it wasn't satisfying or sweet, just empty. I didn't celebrate their downfall. There was nothing noble in their failure, but I took it as confirmation that lies, no matter how smooth, can't build anything that stands. That Christmas, a girl named Raina, just 16, stood on our small center's stage and shared her story. She'd been living in her car. She'd nearly dropped out of school. But after joining our trades program, she landed an apprenticeship in a body shop. She smiled, and I saw something in her face I hadn't seen in a long time. A quiet confidence, a sense of mattering. After her speech, she came to me and said, "I thought people like me didn't get second chances." I touched her shoulder and told her, "People like you are why we built this place." When I got home that night, I opened the drawer by my bed and pulled out Mason's final letter again. I didn't cry this time. I just read it aloud, slowly, and thanked him. Not just for being my son, but for giving me something to keep building long after the wreckage. I don't know what comes next. None of us ever do. But I do know this. You can lose everything and still be full of something worth giving. You can be broken open and still carry light. And sometimes, even when everything inside you says stop, you find the strength to begin again. If this story touched something in you, maybe reminded you of your own quiet strength or someone you lost, take a breath with me right now. You're not alone. And if you're still standing after all you've been through, that's not weakness, that's grace. If you feel like sharing your story or just saying hello, I'll be reading every comment below. Thank you for listening. Stay gentle with your heart.